Hi, we're here with Lena Tenney from the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. Lena is the coordinator of public engagement there at the Ohio State University, and they direct facilitation portfolio of the Race and Cognition program, which includes traveling around the nation to facilitate trainings about things like implicit bias, structural racism, and being an active bystander, which is what we'll be talking about today. Lena is also the co-author of the 2017 edition of the Kirwan Institute's State of Science, the Implicit Bias Review publication, and co-creator of the Implicit Bias module series online learning platform. Lena holds a Master's of Education and a Master's of Public Administration from the University of Oklahoma, and we are thrilled to be talking with you here today. Thank you, Lena.
Thank you for having me. Definitely my pleasure.
So I'm wondering if you can start by telling us a little bit more about your background and also your role at the Kirwan Institute.
Definitely. So at the Kirwan Institute, we work as an engaged research institute, and really what that means is, what is the purpose of research? It really should be to put things into practice and hopefully to make the world a more equitable place. And part of how we do that is through public engagement, through learning opportunities. And as such, I get to facilitate workshops, trainings, webinars, you name it, around these sorts of critical conversations and topics. Very much race-based, and also through an intersectional lens where we're also addressing the interlocking of various forms of identity and various forms of oppression.
So you're here today to talk with us about bystander intervention. Mm-hmm. Can we back up a little bit, and can you tell us, why do we need this training?
One of the really important things about this type of training is that consistently, as I was doing workshops around implicit bias, the feedback would be, this is really helpful to know, and now that I know how to notice bias, what do I actually do about it? So this idea of actually addressing bias, not just recognizing it, sort of seemed like the fitting next step in the conversation for a lot of folks. And a lot of folks really having really good intentions, really wanting to make a difference in the world, speaking up for their colleagues, defending their friends, and even just speaking out in favor of justice are things that people tend to be motivated to do and aren't necessarily super equipped. They might find themselves just not knowing the right words and then losing the opportunity to say something because it takes a little while to gather yourself and decide how you're going to intervene. So this sort of approach is really about, how do we do a lot of the work beforehand and prepare ourselves, knowing that these sorts of instances of bias are inevitable in a society that's full of bias. How do we already commit beforehand to speaking up and have some go-to strategies that you just have something in your back pocket of, I don't have to be brilliant, I don't have to be super articulate in the moment, I don't have to be an expert, but I can say something.
You don't have to have the perfect expertise or the exact right thing to say, but saying something.
Yes, absolutely.
Is really important. You talked about bias. Can you tell us, what is the definition? What is implicit bias? We hear the word microaggression a lot these days. Can you tell us what that is, and also maybe some examples in a professional setting?
So implicit bias is really just the thinking that our brains do without us realizing that it's happening, and it oftentimes ends up manifesting by having biases in favor of or against different social identity groups. And it happens without us noticing it. It's automatically activated. We have no control over it per se, but there is research about how we can adjust for bias, how we can account for it, and even mitigate and lessen manifestations of bias. And a lot of those manifestations of bias take the form of microaggressions. And really a microaggression it's called microaggression not because they're small or insignificant, but rather that they are sort of easily excused, and that folks can, there's sort of almost a plausible deniability, or that people genuinely don't understand why what they're saying is ignorant or offensive. So it's the smaller incidents as opposed to something like a blatant hate crime, or what we might think of as old-fashioned racism that's sort of in your face.
Can you give us some examples?
Absolutely. So a pretty common one, especially in academia and higher education, would be backhanded compliments. Okay. A lot of them are framed around not expecting someone of a certain identity to maybe be as competent as they are. So a common one is that many Black women face the comment of, "You're so articulate," after they do well in a lecture or running a meeting. Now, the person might have intended it as a compliment, but really there's this hidden message around, I'm surprised that you're able to express yourself well, particularly in a professional setting. Or a lot of Asian and Asian American students, when they come to campus for the first time, might be greeted with questions like, what's your name? Where are you from? No, where are you really from? Where is your family from?
You can't possibly be American.
Yes, it's this sort of eternal foreigner myth that anyone who's Asian must not be a fifth-generation American. Whereas white first-year students are asked, what's your name? Where are you from? What do you plan to study? What clubs are you going to be involved with? So there's sort of this dehumanization by putting people into very strict boxes and not seeing them as a full person. And I tend to think of microaggressions as being like paper cuts. If you get one paper cut, by itself, it's not that big of a deal. You can take care of it and move on, probably forget about it potentially. But if every morning you wake up and you know you're probably going to experience somewhere between 0 and maybe 10 paper cuts, over time, you might start to feel a certain way about paper. You start bracing for the impact, you start anticipating what forms it might take. And that's how microaggressions function. It's not about always the singular incident, it's about a lifetime of encountering these sorts of microaggressions. And the psychology literature shows that experiencing microaggressions is tied to real health outcomes for folks. Things like anxiety, depression, psychological distress, fatigue, even behaviors such as engaging in binge drinking or even suicide ideation. So living in a society that doesn't value your full humanity can actually make you physically ill.
So what do we do about this? I mean, if you can tell us a little bit more. I know that the Kirwan Institute has developed this bystander intervention. What does it look like? What are the steps?
Yeah, so the first step is actually noticing that something's happening, which seems obvious, but is a little bit more complex than that. Part of the problem is that things like racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, these things are actually very normalized in our society, and they're pretty embedded in even things like casual phrases that we use without thinking about it. So to actually take the time to be aware of things like language patterns, what is affirming language for different population groups, and so then being able to notice when a microaggression is happening rather than excusing it as like, well, I'm sure that that person didn't mean it that way, but rather to notice and then to commit to doing something. So making a commitment of I am going to speak up in some form or another. And the next step is to strategize. It's hard to do in the moment sometimes because you might be shocked or overwhelmed by what someone said.
Right, for me sometimes I'm just sort of frozen in the moment of did that just really happen? Like the title of your talk.
Yeah.
Did I hear that correctly? Can we rewind a second? I can't imagine that actually really did happen.
Right.
And then sometimes you start questioning yourself that maybe I'm being too sensitive and so sometimes and then by the time you've figured all of that out, the moment is gone.
Yeah, now we're 5 minutes in. It's going to be a little weird to be like, hey, can we rewind the really racist thing that just happened? Because now I'm ready to address it. So really doing that pre-work can be really helpful of knowing yourself, knowing what tends to be your baseline, being able to analyze things like power dynamics, the context of institutional norms, and making a commitment of, in general, in these sorts of contexts, this is how I'm going to approach it. Whereas in these types of situations, I might not speak up because that person does have the ability to fire or not promote me. That's a consideration that it's okay to make. Or if your safety's in question, you might not speak up in those instances, and that's okay, and don't feel guilty about it. But being committed to something like, well, if this is a colleague, and I'm overhearing a colleague say something that is demeaning to a student, that's a time where I actually have a lot of power to step in and be able to help uplift that student's voice and speak to a colleague who might listen to me more than they might to a first-year student who they think is just easily offended. And to have strategies in place of how to intervene in ways that are going to reach people as opposed to sort of tapping into that very natural human reaction of getting defensive when you think someone's saying that you're a bad person.
Right. So how would you, and maybe in a situation where you're the bystander, you're a colleague, and another colleague is saying something to a student that you notice the student was offended by, what would you recommend that person say to be a good active bystander?
Yeah. So it might depend quite a bit on the exact phrase that's being used and probably the identities of who's involved in the situation. But a general sort of baseline is you can always open a conversation with, I couldn't help but overhear this conversation and I was wondering if I might join in. And then bringing yourself into the conversation and perhaps addressing something like, I thought maybe what I had heard was X. And if that was the case, I was wondering if we could maybe check in about that. And other options could include, maybe you don't say something in the moment, maybe the moment passes because you're still trying to figure out what to do. You could still take the opportunity to speak to that colleague later. Doing follow-up work is still a form of intervention, and maybe pulling that colleague aside, having a one-on-one conversation that feels lower stakes. That person's less likely to get defensive because they don't feel like they're being embarrassed in front of other people, and say something like, hey, I was thinking a lot. I think I overheard this conversation in the hallway with a student yesterday, and I was just thinking about, our values at the University of Nevada, Reno, and how we really want to reflect that back in terms of students feeling included and affirmed for who they are. I know that you're an ally, and that's exactly why I wanted to follow up with you, because I think that thing that you said, I think you didn't mean any harm by it, but I think that student might have had a pretty negative experience with that sort of phrase. So can we talk about what happened?
That's such a great way to come at this without creating that defensiveness, right? Those I statements, I know you want to be a great ally, reminding them of the values and of the institution and of the moment and of their values as well. And then it sounds like trying to work with them to find a way to act in a way that's consistent with those values.
And I think it's also powerful to remember that we are all on journeys towards equity and justice. None of us are ever going to be done or finished or perfect. And that can actually be a powerful mindset in calling people into conversation, giving people a chance to know and do better. So saying things like, hey, I didn't actually know until recently that this language is actually considered pretty outdated and offensive. And since I just learned this, I thought maybe I'd share that with you as well. And then it's really, we're having a conversation as opposed to someone riding in on a white horse, saving people who might not actually want to be saved, or exiling people who genuinely might have had good intentions and might be coming from a place of ignorance in the true sense, but rather extending that generous hand of, hey, we're all in this together. How do we work together to create a more inclusive environment? And part of that is going to be holding each other accountable for our actions, even while giving each other the benefit of the doubt that we didn't mean to do harm.
Right. So coming at it from that perspective of giving them the grace to make a mistake, the benefit of the doubt. And really, you're not just being an ally to the person who was offended, but you're being an ally to the person of how can we work together to create this more inclusive space.
Yeah, and I think bystander intervention, it's really critical to think about who is in the room, who is experiencing what. And we can also hold space for the ultimate goal of achieving a more equitable society. So yes, it's about these microaggressions and individual comments, but it's also about bringing people along and achieving those sorts of overarching goals of things like creating a university that is affirming of everyone, as opposed to really siloing folks or making people choose what parts of themselves they bring to work or to the classroom.
Sure. And I would imagine that if people are affected by this and they're using so much of their energy just to deal with all those paper cuts, that what are they not bringing to their own experience and also just to this space of learning as a whole? So we all miss out when folks are marginalized that way.
Yeah, there tends to be this framing that inclusive classrooms, inclusive campuses are really about benefiting people with marginalized identities. That is absolutely the case. And inclusivity actually benefits everyone. When we have more inclusive environments, everyone is able to be their true selves, which means that they're able to come up with innovative ideas that maybe no one has thought of before. And they're not afraid to bring up that suggestion because there isn't a fear that they're going to be immediately shut down because of who they are versus what their idea was. And we see these kinds of dynamics play out in terms of gender in things like staff meetings or department meetings, where a woman might come up with a really great idea and the response is maybe sort of tepid or, okay, we'll think about it. And then a male colleague says something very similar a few minutes later, and now we're going to talk about this, right? And then that person ends up getting credit, gets asked to head the task force that's going to look into the new initiative. And that's not about feelings. That's about pipelines. It's about the justice of people getting credit for their work. And one suggestion of how you could intervene in that moment is say something like, this is fantastic. I think we're reaching some consensus about what direction we're going to go in, because Jane had this really great idea. Thank you, Jane. And John reaffirmed we should look in that direction. Thanks, John, for the support.
That's great.
So we sort of tactfully navigated a situation where we might not know John's intentions. He might have been trying to be an active bystander and be like, wait, why are we not talking about Jane's idea? And then other people are going to give him the credit because of things like gender norms and stereotypes and implicit bias, but instead creating a more equitable meeting space where people can not be afraid to share their good ideas or fear that their work will be stolen.
Right. Well, because I can imagine if nobody says anything, then Jane eventually will shut down and stop making those contributions that could be great for that company.
Yeah, and we don't want folks to be keeping their heads down. We want them to really be able to actively contribute. Because what exactly is the point of recruiting and attracting top talent if we are not going to retain them? If folks are going to leave for other places that actually value them, then we're not doing ourselves any favors if we are putting all that effort in and then not allowing people to be themselves.
Absolutely. So with respect to choosing when and how to intervene and be a bystander, tell me a little bit about making a choice to say something in that moment, sort of in front of all the players that are present, versus maybe waiting and talking to the person who was the source of the microaggression a little bit later. Because I imagine there's pros and cons of both. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So one thing to consider, we might think of two main buckets of strategies, calling in versus calling out. So calling in is really about inviting people to further discussion, having dialogue, further conversation, tends to mitigate defensiveness, whereas calling out, the strategy there a lot of the time is ending the conversation, making the invisible very visible, and even things like sort of like this public shaming effect of the sort of like you're being a terrible person effect. But both calling in and calling out are valid strategies. You just might want to be thoughtful about which one you're using in which circumstances. So if you are in a classroom and someone says something extremely offensive, that is unacceptable behavior, that you know that there's no good intentions gone wrong, someone is trying to be really problematic, that might be a time where you call it out and shut down the conversation and say something like, that is completely inappropriate behavior. That will never happen again in this classroom.
Wow, okay.
Something like that can be really powerful in terms of the messaging to everyone in the space, making sure all students know that this is not acceptable behavior, and that we're not going to allow someone to make these sorts of comments at the expense of their peers. Most of the time in professional settings, we're probably going to be choosing to call people in because we're navigating things like collegiality among folks that we need to continue to work with. And this might also be the case in family or friend settings. A very common dynamic is folks will say, well, I love my grandmother, but every time we have a family gathering, we know there's going to be some sort of fight about politics or immigration or
Thanksgiving dinner, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of a classic example of like people that you love and care about and want to maintain a relationship, but also that you don't want to leave those sorts of things unchecked or unaddressed. Especially if we're committed to inviting people to know and do better. So calling in tends to be pretty effective, and then you have to make the choice of what would it look like in terms of calling people in, making sure that the people who are present in the room are getting the messaging of like, this is not acceptable behavior, we're going to address it, as opposed to letting it slide, not letting silence be complicity or consent to bias being perpetuated. So to even say something like, hey, maybe we can talk about this later. Maybe this is a side conversation, but I don't actually agree with that. So let's go ahead and table it. But I just felt like I needed to say something. That could be an effective strategy. You don't have to be brilliant or articulate or an expert, but to just say something. An example around something like street harassment, that's something that a lot of folks don't know how to combat. Actually, I have some really good friends who are men that what they tend to say is something like, hey, that's not how we treat women here. And it's a pretty simple phrase to just have available, and it really is about things like expectations of behavior, and saying that's not how we do things here.
And going back to our values. That's what we do, that's what we don't do.
Absolutely, yeah, and setting a new norm instead of just saying don't do that, we're actually setting an expectation of what would it look like to aspire for better. And one thing that you can do is even just saying something in the moment. So if you're not sure what to say, a lot of the time what I'll do is I'll just say, I'm not sure what I think about that. I'm going to think about that a little bit more. So we've done some of that messaging work where the people around us are probably picking up that I am not in agreement with the thing that was just said.
Or that makes me feel uncomfortable, maybe even.
Yeah, or even the comment of ouch can be pretty powerful and get people thinking about what they said and how it came across. But just saying something, and you can actually buy yourself time to have a more well-formulated, robust response later that you can address one-on-one with that person in a lower pressure environment and say something like, I couldn't stop thinking about that staff meeting and the comment that happened. I felt like there was some tension in the room, and I wanted to come back to that conversation if you're okay with us talking about it more. And then you can have your well-researched, well-argued sort of conversation where you're going to use humor to reach them. But for many of us, we find ourselves really in that fight, flight, or freeze mode because these sorts of things are emotional experiences. And so if you're someone who tends to freeze, you can commit to just saying something like, I'm not sure what I think about that. And then you can go home and instead of replaying the scenario of what you should have said over and over
you
again.
think of the perfect thing to say that next morning in the shower, right?
Yes, exactly. Once you no longer can actually use that, suddenly your brain is able to come up with a response. But instead to channel that energy and replay scenarios of, okay, tomorrow when I have that one-on-one conversation with that person, how am I going to approach that? And how am I going to have that meaningful discussion with them?
So what I'm hearing you say is practicing, sort of having it at the ready, so that even if you're flustered in the moment, you kind of have some ideas about what you want to say. And then if you really are caught off guard, to say something, even like a whoa or an ouch, or I'm not sure what I think about that, or that makes me uncomfortable. To can we check in on that later?
Absolutely.
That buys you some time that you can't think of that perfect sort of response, or maybe check with somebody else and get somebody else's perspective on that.
Absolutely. It can be really helpful to have colleagues, friends, family, confidants that we can check in with one another. And it's really powerful after a meeting where something seems off to check in with someone you have a relationship with and say, hey, can we talk about that meeting? I'm not sure what it was. I don't know, do you know how that sort of played out or the reasons behind that? And another part of being a bystander can actually be the follow-up. So you don't want to go around tokenizing like the one diverse person in the office by saying something like, well, something sexist happened and I just wanted to see if you're okay. But to have intentional conversations with folks that you already have a relationship with and say something like, hey, I don't know that I did the best job addressing it at the moment, but I did want to follow up with you and see how are you doing if you want to talk about it. And if you don't want to talk about it, I totally respect that. Just know that I'm here for you.
But I would imagine that even just acknowledging that you also realized that something that happened that might have been a microaggression, and then debriefing with the person that was the target of that.
Yes, and that can give us space to strategize for the next time it happens, because we know that these things, while they feel like one-off instances, a lot of the time they are patterns of behavior or have become institutional culture or norms. So to have a strategy and to have allies or co-conspirators that you already have some sort of plan in place, the next time something like this happens, we know how we're going to address it. And we know that if you say something, I will back you up, because that's pretty powerful too.
And so on that note, how do you avoid being like the knight that comes in and rescues? I mean, how do you avoid giving the message that I will come and fix this for you versus I'm here to support you?
It's very important to think about. I think one thing is just starting from the framing that no one needs a savior. What they need is people to uplift their voice. And that's something that allies can do, is create more space in order for people to be able to speak up for themselves. And sometimes you might be speaking about an identity that's not your own, because there is actually that additional space. We know that people with dominant identities listen to other people with that identity more than they listen to people with marginalized identities. White people listen to white people about racism more closely than they tend to listen to people of color. Similarly with the LGBTQ community, folks tend to listen to allies more than they do LGBTQ folks themselves. There's a lot of reasons for that. But that's a powerful space to be in, is to know that your messaging might be received more kindly or be more welcomed, and to not take up space, to not be doing this work because you want to be seen as a good person, or to be seen as this sort of champion, but rather you're doing this work because it's going to make a difference in the world. And it's not about getting praise, it's about improving things for other folks. So one thing you can do practically, if you think someone in the room has the identity that's been targeted, is you can just wait a couple of seconds to allow time for someone to decide if they want to speak for themselves or not. And then someone might speak up, and very well could have faced that microaggression many times over a lifetime. They might have a pre-prepared response. Or if that empowerment isn't there in the moment, to frame it as such, something like, hey, I know this isn't my experience, I'm definitely not the expert on this, but I still feel like I need to say something because we know that we value an inclusive culture here, so I think we need to address these sorts of things. And then you're not speaking over someone or on behalf of someone who hasn't asked you to be their mouthpiece, but instead just creating space and creating expectations of what inclusivity really looks like.
And I would imagine, depending on the nature of your relationship with that person, to even strategize that, hey, especially because we know that these tend to be recurrent, if this happens again, how can I support you? How can I best support you in this?
Absolutely. I think one of the most powerful questions that we can ask is, what does support look like for you? And then to follow through on what that individual person has asked for us to do. Because we still do need to let folks decide what respect looks like for them, and then actually do the work once we promise that we will.
So let me ask you another question. What if you are the one that made the comment, and maybe you meant it as a compliment, but you suddenly noticed that it wasn't taken that way? What do you do to maybe be an ally in that situation?
Even those of us who are really committed to things like equity and justice, we are still going to mess up. It's actually inevitable. So to just accept that fact from the get-go, that this work is going to be messy, it is going to be hard, oftentimes it's going to be thankless, and to just have that be our predisposition. That way, when someone informs us that something we've said was not as okay as we thought it was, then we don't have to have this sort of internal battle of, does this mean I'm a bad person because I messed up this one time? But rather to ground yourself and remember, okay, this is not about me being a good or bad person. This is someone inviting me to do better and holding me accountable for my actions.
I love that.
Which is a very kind and generous thing to do for folks, because who we don't take the time to educate or invite to do better tends to be the people that we're not invested in the relationship.
So someone cares enough about you.
Absolutely.
And maybe trusts you.
Yes.
To really hold that.
Yeah, a mentor of mine, Kathy Wong, once told me, Lena, when someone tells you that something you did was not okay or was biased, they're giving you a little gift. They're giving you the gift of their time and energy to help you know better, and they're giving you the gift of a second or third or fourth chance.
It's like when someone tells you you have something in your teeth.
Absolutely.
Right, which is embarrassing, but ultimately you're thankful that that person didn't let you proceed for the whole next hour with a big piece of lettuce or something stuck in your teeth. To be thankful and then to go and privately remove it and then to proceed.
Absolutely. And funnily enough, I actually tend to use a similar phrasing sometimes around when I'm going to let someone know that there's something in their teeth, or if they said something that maybe wasn't totally well thought out. And sometimes that I'm telling you because I want people to tell me this, that there's something in my teeth, and that's why I wanted to talk to you about
that someone cared enough about you to tell you that rather than let you go the whole rest of your day.
Right, embarrassing yourself.
Well, because I've had that too, and I've had conversations with people, say after lunch, and then several hours later I look in the mirror and I'm like, that person let me know. And then
Right.
you wonder what's the level of trust or caring. I think if somebody cares enough about you to tell you, that's pretty meaningful. And I hope that, you know, that can be honored, and I wouldn't get defensive. No, I don't have something in my
Right.
teeth, but oh my gosh, you know, let me go take care of it.
Right. Insisting that there's not a problem does no good in terms of actually addressing the problem. We have to name these things for what they are. And we can do that both by responding well when someone tells us that we've messed up and by doing our own work, starting with ourselves, being proactive, educating ourselves, whether it's reading some articles. There's some great stuff on YouTube you can view from all sorts of experts. And to do that work ourselves, and to also be willing to help other people along.
Right. So to thank someone for telling you, to acknowledge it, and maybe to apologize.
Absolutely.
And like, you're right, I can see how you'd see it that way, right? I didn't mean it that way, but I can absolutely see how that would be offensive.
Right.
And I'm going to really work on that.
Yeah. Being able to remember that your intentions were good, but still repair the harm that was done, because outcomes are more important than our intentions if we're actually trying to change things like culture. So saying very simply, thank you so much for letting me know. I had never realized how that phrase came across. I really appreciate you taking the time to tell me. I'm going to do better now. It's a pretty simple conversation to have, and so much more transformative than saying something like, I don't know, I think you might be a little too sensitive about that.
You're being too sensitive.
Yeah, then we're doing even more harm than we already did in the first place.
Well, because most of the time when people experience this, they're sort of questioning themselves anyways, right? Am I being too sensitive? But they're having this very valid experience of being upset.
Right.
So if somebody takes that seriously, it's very affirming and validating, rather than adding to that self sort of confusion and wondering wondering if you fit in, and is this the right place for you?
I think it would be fantastic if we could have more bold conversations with care, to talk about the difficult things and to do so in ways that are really inviting people into the conversation and helping people along.
Absolutely. You talked a little bit about intention, and this is some place that I see people getting stuck a lot, that, you know, oh, I didn't intend it that way.
Right.
As you said before, the outcome is still there.
Right. So I tend to think of this as, if you accidentally knock a glass over and it hits the floor and shatters, what's the difference between that versus if you had picked up the glass and smashed it on the ground on purpose? Intentions. But if we actually focus on the glass might not care a whole lot whether it was an accident or on purpose.
Broken either way.
Because it's broken.
Yeah.
And so that's where outcome really should be what we're focusing on, while we also hold space for knowing people's intentions. Because knowing someone's intentions can help us strategize of how to reach them by moving around that sort of defensiveness. But we still need to hold ourselves and others accountable, because otherwise when we pretend like our intentions are the only thing that matter, well, I didn't mean to knock that glass over, therefore there's no glass on the ground. Then we end up stepping in the glass and making the situation considerably worse.
Cutting our feet, right?
Right, versus just saying, oh, I messed up, let me get a broom.
Right, let me help you clean this up.
Right.
Yeah. So you've talked about intention and sort of whether or not it matters. I like to try to come at these situations with the assumption that there wasn't an intention. I think it helps me to be more empathic. What do we do is there a way to handle this when it was intentional or hateful?
And I think that's where calling in and calling out can come back into play. So if you know that someone is intentional, you know someone is being hateful on purpose, you know that they're trying to goad you into having an angry response, in those moments calling something out might be more effective, so that you're not wasting your time and energy trying to educate someone who actually knows fully what they're doing. So in those kinds of moments, even saying something like, you know, I know we don't agree on this issue. It sounds like we're never going to agree on this issue. I'm not going to say agree to disagree, because I think it's too important, but I will say, let's not have this fight right now. We know where each other are coming from. Let's just not do this and let's move on. That can be helpful in those family situations where everyone knows where on the political spectrum everyone lies. And instead of having to rehash the same debates where people are not actually listening to one another, we can say something like, you know, not today. I don't have the time. I don't have the energy.
Well, and I imagine that might be a good strategy in the classroom as well, because when you're the professor and you're running the classroom, it's your responsibility to say something. You may be torn between kind of tackling that
Right.
versus continuing with the content that needs to be covered that day.
Mm-hmm.
So having that conversation, I think, could be a good strategy.
Definitely. And we have to think about the long-term environment that we're creating. When we miss our opportunity to pause the conversation and address something that's happened, it really doesn't allow that space to remain inclusive for everyone who is there and experienced it. So the sort of long-term investment in having these conversations, they are difficult, they require courage, and they're completely worth doing anyway.
And I've heard so many times from students who have been in the room when a comment gets made and the professor probably frozen and paralyzed out of not knowing what to say, ignores it or changes the topic, and the hurt and the anger that those students experience.
Yes.
Not feeling welcome, like you
Right. What tends to happen is a lot of the time we end up valuing peace or comfort instead of safety and humanity. And so a lot of the time we have this worry of like, well, what if I make things worse, or I don't want to then offend the person who said something ignorant. But that's not recognizing that the humanity of the person who's been targeted by a comment, their humanity and ability to remain engaged in a classroom environment is actually more important than someone feeling awkward about the fact that they're being called out for saying something biased. So it really is, how do we value safety and humanity rather than focusing only on comfort?
I like how you phrased that.
Yeah, because the comfort of people who are perpetuating harm is not more important than the safety and humanity of the people who are being harmed. But a lot of the time, we end up prioritizing comfort instead of safety.
Wow, that's very profound. Absolutely.
I try.
This has been great in terms of being an ally in these steps and just the phrasing of how you said these things. How else can we be allies? How else can we contribute towards these inclusive environments?
A really important thing is there are lots of strategies we can implement that will actually preempt bias from happening in the first place. So the more we do the front end work of creating an inclusive campus, the less we'll be called upon to address things like hate crimes or bias incidents or microaggressions. So having policies and procedures in place that provide clear guidelines that when people come to campus as a first-year student, they know that we are committed to an inclusive campus, and that if you're going to be at the University of Nevada at Reno, that you are expected to treat others with respect. Or even having policies in place such as having a syllabus that includes an inclusive classroom statement. It could be phrased something like, we are going to have difficult conversations in this class. We will not always agree. You're welcome to share your opinions and experiences from whatever perspectives you bring here. Those will be valued. What will not be tolerated is the dehumanization of any person, whether they're in this classroom or not. And that gives people an expectation that they can meet. And when something does happen, you can direct people back to the syllabus statement of, hey, can you rephrase that? Because right now what you're actually doing is you're targeting people as opposed to making a rational argument about a policy position. And then people can have the opportunity to think, okay, how do I reframe this in order to meet that expectation? And even having things like reporting lines where when something happens and someone's not sure what to do, they feel disempowered, that there's some sort of resource they can go to, whether it's a reporting line, whether it's an affinity space, whether it's a multicultural center, whether it's a faculty member who is known to be a champion for folks of that identity, that there's somewhere people can go and that they can talk about things. And even things like structural change in policies. You know, what does the non-discrimination policy look like? That's huge. Non-discrimination policies don't always actually include all of the identities that our students bring to the table, or that our staff or faculty bring to the table, or things like having gender-inclusive restrooms in buildings. That's going to avoid a lot of difficult conversations in bathrooms when people are perceiving that someone doesn't belong in the same space as them.
Right. Or when students are making plans of having to run all the way across campus to the one building that has the gender-neutral bathroom and then be late to the next class.
Yep, exactly. Such a struggle.
Just having to plan their day around that, which is, like, think about, again, the energy that goes into that.
Right.
That could be going into so many other things.
Right, like writing that paper that's due next week instead.
Right, or getting the A instead of the B or something like that.
Right, and even things that seem small, like including pronouns in email signatures. It's pretty low effort, but very high return, because when folks start doing that and normalizing the conversation about pronouns, everyone benefits. And then it's no longer transgender people always constantly outing themselves by saying, my name is Lena, my pronouns are they, them. Instead, if everyone is sharing their name and their pronouns, then it's just part of conversation, and we're just being respectful about how we use the best possible language for someone, the language that's affirming for them.
I love that. And you're also giving a message.
Right, absolutely.
And creating that inclusive space.
Yeah.
Where other,
yeah, you're sending the message, trans folks are valued here. And that's a pretty radical message, to be quite honest.
Wow.
It shouldn't be like the bar is so low.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it means we have a lot of opportunity. There's so much opportunity to do better. And any moves that we make are going to benefit folks.
Right. And I think sometimes people get stuck of I have to have the exact right thing to say, or I have to be a scholar in this area. What is the message that you would give to those folks about stepping up and being an ally, even if you don't feel totally comfortable or knowledgeable?
Yeah. I would say you do not have to be an expert on everything to affirm someone's humanity. You don't have to understand everything about a person's lived experience to know that they should have human dignity and be treated fairly. And you can even frame your message that way of, I'm really not the expert on this, but I feel like we need to speak up for all of our community members. It's a simple but powerful phrase. And then you're, again, not speaking over anyone or trying to insert yourself as an expert. But that can be a pretty powerful tool to use of just affirming people's humanity. And then we're not having debates about people's humanity. We're just saying everyone has human dignity. We're going to respect that, how people tell us they want to be respected.
And it's been my experience, even though I've fumbled many times, that if your authenticity and your intentions can be perceived, that you buy yourself a little bit of diplomatic immunity, so that even if you do use the wrong pronoun, but that person knows that you're trying and maybe you just blundered a little bit. So it's been my experience that it sort of takes the pressure off of me, that I don't have to be perfect. I mean, it's my job to learn and know and try, but I don't have to be perfect.
Doing our best is pretty transformative work. And the more we have relationships with one another, where we are having continued conversations, the more that these things are going to move forward in very natural ways, as opposed to feeling forced. And it is important to hold ourselves accountable without putting ourselves in fear, so that we become so frozen about worrying about messing up that we make no effort, because that doesn't do anyone any good.
Absolutely.
And also to hold...
And it actually does harm. And not only does it do good, but it does harm.
Definitely. And to hold space for ourselves to mess up, and to hold space for people's reactions. So yes, most of the time people might be pretty patient with us if they know that we're trying. And also when someone is not patient with us, to not get upset at them, because their reaction is valid. We did harm.
Maybe it's the 14th time that morning.
And it might be the first time you've said that thing, but it might not be the first time that that person has experienced that sort of comment. So to hold ourselves accountable to doing better, and to not get discouraged or stop doing the work because it's hard. We have to stay in the struggle, or else nothing's going to get better. And we can't only be allies to people when they're nice to us about holding us accountable. That's not actually real allyship work, but instead to stay engaged, especially when the conversation gets tough. Because I know some of the hardest conversations to hear are the ones that I most need to receive.
So Lena, you have given us so much to think about. If somebody were to watch this and take away one most important point, what would that be?
I think something that really resonates for me is a quote from Audre Lorde. And she says, when we speak, we're afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed, but when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak. And that's something that really compels me to keep doing the hard work of speaking up, is remembering we're already encountering these uncomfortable, awkward, unjust situations anyway. So what are we afraid of in speaking up? Because it's more powerful for us to say something than to continue the normal pattern of letting things remain unchecked and normalized. Nothing gets better if we're not willing to say something.
Absolutely.
Even if we don't end up being brilliant all the time, and even if someone reacts poorly, that's actually not a loss. And remembering that speaking up is not the problem. the actual oppression is the issue. So a lot of the time there's this sort of idea of, well, if we would just stop talking about race, then racism would go away. And that's not actually true.
Right.
Racism is real and it already exists. So it's much more powerful to, in spite of our fears of talking about racism and having hard conversations, to speak up against racism anyway, because that's going to be what slowly but surely transforms our world.
So be willing to be uncomfortable and speak up, even if you're uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
Because it's in the service of your values.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, it's a values conversation. What do you believe in, and what are you willing to work towards and make some sacrifices for? Because it's not going to be easy work. If it were easy, the world would already be a perfect place. But instead to commit to having the hard conversations because they matter.
And because we all benefit from it.
Absolutely. We are all better. It's that old adage that your freedom is bound up in my freedom, so let's get free together.
Nice. It has been such a pleasure to talk with you today. Thank you so much for visiting us here at the University of Nevada, Reno, and thank you for this conversation.
My pleasure. This has been lovely.